Okay, so if I could just get you to tell us a little bit about yourself and what you've been up to.
Sure, yeah. Well, I'm Matthew, a photographer and a senior lecturer here at Southampton Solent University. I was born in Liverpool. I grew up in Brussels. I moved over to London in the early 90s to go to university. And then I've been over here ever since. So I've kind of worked in the industry, and now, as you know, I'm teaching.
Awesome. So what inspired you to become a photographer?
I suppose we've got to go way back there. I think it was probably around my 11th, 12th, 13th birthday, something like that. My dad gave me a Praktica camera, which is a kind of manual SLR camera, film analog camera. Obviously, going back to the kind of mid 80s. He was a keen photographer himself, so he had a home darkroom when we were growing up. Maybe I was a little bit too young to remember that, but the photographs were always present in the house. And I just got really enthused. I just really started to experiment with the camera, and I started to kind of work with sparklers and long exposure times, cameras on tripods. And he had some old cameras as well. I was kind of fascinated by the mechanics of the camera itself. These were very kind of, they were analog, they're tactile. You could open them up, you could take everything apart. So he had a kind of old broken camera, and I'd take it apart and put it back together again. So the whole thing just fascinated me. And I suppose that was the earliest time that I got involved with photography.
So you obviously now teach documentary photography, to me at least. What made you go into that sort of...
Into documentary?
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose again it was because when I was a student studying photography, I was just experimenting with different kinds of photography. And I suppose I started to become quite interested in street photographers and street photography, and socially concerned photographers like Cartier-Bresson, and the American street photographers like Gary Winogrand, Lee Friedlander, Diane Arbus, and so started to kind of look at their work and started to really see the power, what was possible with the still image. And it wasn't really until, I suppose, early 90s, there was a project that was published in The Observer by a photographer called Dario Mitidieri around street children in Bombay. And it was a kind of probably a 10-page spread. You used to get lots of pages in magazines back in the day. And over this spread, I started to realize photography's ability to tell a story, to be able to kind of help the narrative, to understand the narrative capabilities of photography. And so that was really what started to get me interested in to really bring it down to really be interested in documentary photography. So I then went on and did a postgraduate in photojournalism, which really started to get me involved with that area.
Okay, cool. I did a little bit of research. I've seen you've got a background in editorial. Are there any sort of companies of note that you've done any work for? Yeah,
I mean, editorially, so when I finished my postgraduate, I suppose that was late 90s, I started to become involved with the newspaper industry. So straight from college, I went to work under Nigel Scalzi at the Sunday Telegraph. And then after that, I went to the Observer Life magazine. So it's the Sunday supplement for the Observer, which had a rich tradition in documentary photography. But by the time I arrived there, it all seemed to kind of be changing. Everything was moving towards lifestyle orientated, trying to sell you things, very commercial. And then in a freelance capacity, obviously, I worked for different editorial clients, Vogue, Vogue Japan, and I did quite a lot of travel for Virgin had a publishing outfit, Time Out. I've done quite a lot of Time Out, City Guides. So within kind of either working within a kind of day job and also within a kind of freelance capacity as well. How to keep up? It's difficult because everything moves very much quicker than you think it will. Certainly, as kind of digital has revolutionized the industry. When I was starting off, everything was shot on film. So you'd be shooting on slide film, which then you'd maybe get a bike, would take it to the lab. The lab would then process it and take it to the client. You'd never actually see the work. You imagine you're shooting, you're not actually able to see anything before the client gets it. So it's a completely different way. But how you keep up to date with that? I think how I've tried to keep up to date. Obviously, working in education helps because you're working with more modern equipment. You're keeping up to date with recent trends. Obviously, with members of staff, you talk about these things. I keep abreast by making sure I read up with the trade magazines, so things like the British Journal of Photography. I go to exhibitions as much as I can. Festivals are very good as well, so conferences and festivals. There's a lot of photography festivals now, so I try to go to the biggest one in the world is in Arles, in France, south of France, in July. So I try to go there every year, good for networking, keeping up, seeing what works, what photographers are doing. But yeah, so I think those are the things, really, to kind of try and see as much, try and look at as many photographs, and in different contexts as well, not just online, but in book format. I collect books as well. I collect photography books, certainly within the kind of documentary area, so that keeps me abreast of what kind of contemporary photographers are doing within the genre. So yeah, just getting out there and looking at pictures in different contexts.
So what would you say were the advantages of being a photographer? Or what has the industry helped you achieve on a personal point of view?
Well, the advantages, again, I suppose it really depends in what context you're a photographer and what it is that you're doing. But certainly it can, it's photography it can be quite a lonely experience, but that can be a positive thing. You're working for yourself. You're working by yourself often, depending on, again, what kind of photography you do. Obviously, some photography requires teams of people, but certainly not the photography that I do. In terms of achievements, I suppose having exhibitions, having work published in the national press, and certainly more over the last 10, 15 years, I've been kind of working in an area called participatory photography, which is where you would maybe facilitate certain groups of people to use photography to communicate about their lives. So often working with marginalized communities. I did a project in India, an HIV project, which was sponsored by the Bill Gates Foundation. So they sent me out to India. It was a month project where I did a week of workshops with sex workers. So it was all around, I suppose, advocacy for HIV and AIDS, which still is a big problem in India.
Would you say there was any drawbacks or anything that someone coming into the industry should know?
Well, there are plenty of drawbacks. I suppose going back to what I was saying before, it's a lonely business, and I think sometimes if you're working with teams every day, it's a very different dynamic. If you work by yourself, the only person really who can be responsible is you. So you've really got to fight for it every day. You've got to really understand about your niche. You maybe have to carve out a niche. Whether you're being a wedding photographer or a fashion photographer, is to have a sense of that you can create an identity for yourself. Certainly within that, but the drawbacks there are that you've got to almost be a jack of all trades. You've got to be a photographer, you've got to be a marketeer, you've got to be able to you have to create yourself an identity. You've got to be able to get out there and network and build up client lists, and it can be quite overwhelming. You've also got to be someone who understands the business side of things, in terms of your tax returns and invoicing, and so there's it sounds very glamorous to be a photographer, but actually the reality is probably a lot further from that than people expect.
Would you say that was one of the things that you sort of didn't expect before coming?
Certainly before working as a photographer. I mean, when I left college, and as I was building up editorial clients, I didn't know that, and you kind of learn on the job. You learn by making mistakes, and you just that's how we learn.
Cool. So we went into how times have sort of changed. One of them probably being mostly social media. So how would you say you brand yourself?
Well, certainly, I'd say that's an area that I could probably do more work on. I think it's an area that, again, a lot of photographers, maybe from my generation, who maybe don't see the importance of that. But certainly when I'm looking at younger photographers, it's now really the branding has become integral to what it is that they do. Again, it kind of depends on the context of whether they're an art photographer or a commercial photographer. But either way, the marketing and branding, as you put it, is particularly important. And as I've I was teaching part-time, doing freelance work, and then I got offered a full-time position in London. So I took up the full-time position, and then of course what happens is the freelance stuff fades away, picture editors move on. So that's also something to be aware of, that people within the industry move very, very quickly. And if you're not careful, if you've taken a break from a while, you go back and everything's moved on. So you're kind of starting from scratch again. So certainly, platforms, photographers have really taken to Instagram and certainly Facebook as well to a lesser extent, but certainly those two running in tandem are what young, emerging and all photographers are using and exploiting to create a brand for themselves.
Awesome, thanks a lot. I think we've covered everything.
You're welcome.
Yeah.